But today we have Robert Jameson. He will be speaking, he's a PhD candidate in the history department, and he will be speaking on contemporary Czech Republic political problems in a post-communist poster child.
Thank you, Adrian. So good afternoon, everyone. As Adrian said, my name is Bob Jameson. I'll be talking today about the contemporary Czech Republic and some of the political problems that are going on there, some of the wider ramifications that might have. So first off, let's see if this works. It does. After the end of the Cold War, Czechs have increasingly and successfully been branding the country as part of this newer concept of Central Europe, as opposed to the old Cold War binary of Eastern Europe, Western Europe, the West, the East. And they've been doing so rather successfully. This is a series of surveys, both in the United States and in Europe, by different foundations, where people are sort of pegging where countries fit within Europe. And as you can see, sort of in the deepest purple, at the very center of this region, lies the Czech Republic, right, the heart of Central Europe. And indeed, this corresponds to the Czech phrase, right, that Prague, at the capital of the Czech Republic, is Srdce Evropy, right, the heart of Europe. Additionally, since 1989, the Czech Republic has succeeded to NATO in 1999 and the European Union in 2004. And so it's become part of these broader structures within Europe that help to ensure not only security in the case of NATO, but also political and economic integration with broader Europe in the European Union. So the question then becomes, are the political, economic, and security questions in the Czech Republic fundamentally solved? Have they sort of reached the end of history in a lot of ways? I'm going to argue that no. History is not yet over in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's certainly not over in the Czech Republic. Czech politics are unusually fluid and unstable at the moment. We have underlying structural problems that persist. Some of these are common throughout the region and in post-communist countries that are still transitioning. However, some of them are particular to the Czech Republic. Czech mentalities, I'll argue, and this is cultural, can inhibit integration both within NATO and within the European Union. Integration and cooperation both. Because of these three previous factors, Russian exploitation is an ongoing issue and concern in the Czech Republic, and it's certainly not something that can be left on the back burner. And therefore, American disengagement from the region, the decrease in funding for Czech cultural studies, for Czech language learning, is probably unwise. So let's talk about some of the problems in Czech politics, at least as I see them at the moment. The first and most prominent of which, the figurehead in a lot of ways, really is the Czech president at the moment, Miloš Zeman. Now, because of time concerns, I don't think I'm going to show you the actual links that I have of videos of Zeman, but they're fun. Zeman has had some scandalous affairs, not only with public drunkenness, he's been compared to the Boris Yeltsin of the Czech Republic in a lot of ways, but also with concerns about his increasing closeness with the Russian Federation. He's taken some stances that have put him at odds, not only with other NATO allies, but also with general European Union policies toward Russia, especially in the wake of the Ukrainian crisis and the sanctions that were imposed. So Zeman is problematic, and we'll talk more about him in reference to the political scandal in 2013 in just a moment. The second factor is a political party called ANO, which was founded by a Slovak businessman named Andrej Babiš in 2011. Now, ANO has gone from nothing, it did not exist prior to 2011, to, by 2014, the largest political party in the Czech Republic, as judged by the European elections in 2014. In 2013, it was the second largest party in the Czech Republic. Its growth has been extremely rapid, and it's eclipsed some of the more traditional mainstream parties that emerged after the Velvet Revolution, such as the Czech Social Democrats and the Civic Democratic Forum. Part of this is a revolutionary to post-revolutionary shift. So 26 years after the Velvet Revolution, you have the transition from politics that were rooted in whose side politicians stood on during the revolution, where they fell in the left wing or the right wing of that particular struggle, to a newer upcoming generation of politicians who have different concerns. and are reflecting Czechs' mood of frustration with traditional political parties, such as the mainstream left-wing and right-wing parties. Communists remain the third largest party in the Czech Republic. They consistently score anywhere from 10 to 15% of the Czech electorate, and that's a strong base. They do not dip below 10%, and they rarely rise above 20%. But they've also been shut out of Czech politics. Mainstream Czech political parties have refused to form coalitions with the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia thus far. And then, of course, there is the June 2013 mistress and corruption scandal, which is the funnest part, the most fun part of this particular talk. In June 2013, the Czech government, which had been formed under Prime Minister Petr Nečas, collapsed. And it collapsed because on June 13th, 2013, there was a police raid that arrested not only the top aide, but also the mistress of Petr Nečas, as well as the former and current heads of military intelligence in the Czech Republic. What emerged from the scandal was that the Czech Prime Minister's mistress and top aide, Jana Načová, had been using military intelligence assets to spy on the Czech Prime Minister's wife, who she was jealous of. This is a bit of a reversal from traditional roles, which makes the story a bit more interesting. But what emerged from this was not just a typical sex scandal at the top levels of power, but also an issue with corruption. It turned out that Jana Načová, the mistress of Petr Nečas, had also been using party funds to bribe Czech MPs, 3 Czech MPs, to step down from parliament so that crucial votes could be won. So it emerged that there was also an issue of buying influence within the parliament. Oh, did we die already? Oh dear. Well, that was a quick battle. Okay, improvising. So, or does it just not shift at all? That's fine. Oh, here we go. This is Miloš Zeman. He's an old politico who's been involved in Czech politics for the last 2 decades. He was formerly the head of the Czech Social Democrats Party, the mainstream left-wing party. After he stopped leadership of that party in the early 2000s, he formed his own party around his own personality. Okay, I'm not sure why this isn't shifting. Well, Miloš Zeman is involved in the political scandal that brought down Petr Nečas's government over the sex and corruption scandal. Zeman, the timing was very convenient for the collapse of Nečas's government. Nečas was part of the ODS party, the mainstream right-wing party, and Zeman was in opposition to him. Nečas was promoting himself as the Czech Mr. Clean, who was going to root out corruption in the Czech parliamentary system. And so the revelation that he himself was corrupt and involved in these various affairs was just too perfect to pass up. And the police raid that was ordered came at a time where Nečas's government collapsed, and Zeman was now able to appoint the successor, the caretaker government. So it got his political rival out of the picture, and some Czechs have questioned the timing of this raid on Nečas. Is it working now? It worked on small scale, apparently.
Those were nice ones. Do you want to try your clicker?
Well, the clipper battery just kept on a separate issue. Is it on? Okay. Ah! Wonderful. Sorry about that, folks. So yes, the timing was convenient for Miloš Zeman because his political rival was now out of the picture. This is Jana Načová, who is the Prime Minister's mistress, top aide. This is the former Prime Minister Petr Nečas and his wife Radka Nečasová. They're now out of the picture. So moving on, talk about underlying structural problems in the Czech economy. 75% of Czech GDP is tied to exports. which is not in itself a problem, except that the particular things that the Czechs are exporting are things like car parts, steel, automobiles, industries that are increasingly globally competitive. And areas in which the Czech comparative advantage that they enjoyed in the 90s into the early 2000s of relatively cheap, relatively highly skilled labor are eroding over time. And nothing has yet emerged to replace these traditional mainstays of the Czech export economy. In addition, brain drain remains a problem in the Czech Republic. In recent surveys, over half, 53% of Czech scientists and researchers, they plan to move abroad. They plan to move outside the Czech Republic. Nearly half of doctors and IT specialists, 47%, plan to as well. This is in 2010. The 2007 fiscal crisis flattened or reversed growth, GDP growth in the Czech Republic. But as Hungary, a similar economy indicates, the plateau where rapid growth stopped was actually reached earlier. So while the fiscal crisis is being blamed for the plateauing and stopping of Czech GDP growth, in actual fact, it's more likely related to systemic issues. Hungarian growth, as you can see from this next graph here, Czech growth is the middle line in red, Hungarian growth is the lower line in blue, Russian growth is green and red, but it's a very differently structured economy. You can see that in Hungary, growth levels off about 2 years prior to the financial crisis, which causes Czech GDP growth to first tailspin and then very slowly recover. So it's more likely the problems are structural, although right now Czech politicians tend to blame the financial crisis and the drop in European demand for Czech goods as the problem. Why is this an issue? Well, with the end of rapid growth comes the end of one particular teleological argument for where the Czech Republic is headed in terms of deeper and deeper EU integration, in terms of integration within NATO, in terms of economic success on the level of other countries, neighbors like Germany, for example. Nearly half of GDP in the Czech Republic, 42% of all the goods and services produced in the Czech Republic in a given year, are owned by foreign companies, often German. The example that comes to mind is the case of Škoda, long the most famous Czech automobile manufacturer and a champion Czech manufacturer industry. It's owned by Volkswagen now. It's a more successful company than it was when it was a Czech-owned company, but it is owned by Volkswagen. And part of the problem with these foreign-owned companies is that most dividends from their profits exit the Czech Republic to the tune of 210 billion koruna last year alone. This amounts to about $8 billion and about 5% of Czech GDP. That's just exiting the country and not necessarily benefiting the Czech Republic. So moving on to Czech mentalities and worldview, right? The culture of the Czech Republic and some of these things that can be a drag on future growth or integration as well. One is the mentality of Švékism, right? To švék is actually a verb in Czech. And the Mali Český člověk, right? So švék is this fictional character that's created by Jaroslav Hašek, and in many ways he's considered to be the Czech national personification. One English dictionary defines švék as an unlucky and simple-minded but resourceful little man oppressed by higher authorities. This fits in, as I said, with the idea of the Mali Český člověk, who's sort of a little person who wants to have like his domestic comforts and sort of be left alone by the outside world. According to Derek Sayer, actually, in his book, The Coasts of Bohemia, which examines the history of the Czech Republic, he refers to even Czech nationalism as itself a sort of petite bourgeois nationalism. It's not grand, it's not grandiose anymore. Another problem that's related to this a bit, although this can be a larger issue in post-communist countries in transition, is this lack of social and institutional trust in the Czech Republic. So 64% of Czechs in 2008 did not trust their fellow citizens, for survey. A 2012 poll showed that more than half of Czechs in general want to live abroad. Among young people, the figure can be as high as 70%. The Gallup polling agency ranked the Czech Republic as the second most pessimistic country on earth. That's just behind Greece, which has been ravaged by the financial recession. Sorry?
I put Hungary up there too.
They put Hungary up there too. But they rank the Czech Republic as the second most pessimistic country in the world. By the way, that puts it above places like earthquake-ravaged Haiti. The Czech Republic is more pessimistic. And Nigeria. Right, it's not rooted in reality always, but it is a mentality, it's an attitude. This affects cooperation and integration in the European Union and in NATO in various ways. Only about a third of Czechs, for example, rank the EU as a favorable thing that's happened to their country, right? Something that they would choose to be part of. And that's according to Pew Global Trust. Czech defense spending is half of what NATO recommends. NATO recommends 2% of GDP being spent per year on defense. The Czechs spend 1.08%. That is a common problem throughout the NATO alliance, but it is something to bring up with the Czech context. Defense Minister Martin Stropnický, for example, recently in 2014 refused permission for hosting NATO troops in the country at any time in the future, and he cited the 1968 Soviet invasion of the country that quashed the Prague Spring. And last decade's plans for Czech inclusion in the NATO missile defense program that would have included Poland and Romania as well was highly controversial in Czech Republic and was eventually squashed by the Obama administration as part of the reset attempt with Russian relations. This cynicism and mentality of distrust is itself deeply rooted in Czech history. The most recent examples would of course be the betrayal of the great powers at Munich in 1938 that sold Czechoslovakia out to Adolf Hitler, but also Yalta in 1945, which sold Czechoslovakia out to the Soviets, and even earlier famous Czech historical examples like Jan Hus being betrayed and handed over in the 15th century to the emperor and burned alive at stake. So this distrust of outside powers is real, and it's rooted in history, and it's not likely to go away anytime soon. Another recent example of this is the NATO convoy, Operation Dragoon Ride, that passed through the Czech Republic last month. They were in transit through the country as a show of strength, primarily aimed at Russia, but building up forces in Poland, in the Baltic republics, and these frontline states with Russia at the moment. This was, on social media, on the internet, portrayed as something that Czechs would come out in force against. The Czech Communist Party was highly motivated in organizing protests against NATO troops passing through the Czech Republic. And there was a great deal of alleged Russian trolling, Russian-sponsored news sites that were talking about this as an example of NATO trampling all over Czech national sovereignty. And you do have quite a few protesters who come out, right? We have this image here. We have people saying, stop NATO aggression. They claim 2 million people killed, in NATO wars. But by and large, you also saw large counter-protests that came out in force against the mostly communist-sponsored anti-NATO protests. You did see overwhelming numbers, in a lot of cases, much larger numbers of Czechs coming out pro-NATO than anti-NATO. So that is an encouraging sign. This sign, for example, says, Americans stay here and communists out. So a concern in all of this, if we set up the Czech Republic as more volatile, more fluid of a situation than we traditionally have assumed, then one issue that comes to the fore is Russian exploitation and Czech vulnerability to Russian exploitation. So a recent commentator, Nadia Shadlo, has written about the Russian pursuit of the doctrine of hybrid war. And hybrid war, she says, is a blend of military, economic, diplomatic, criminal, and informational means to achieve desired political goals inside countries that Russia is not actually at war with frequently. And the goal of hybrid warfare is really the injection of so much uncertainty into NATO, into the European Union, that they collapse under their own principle of allied consensus. One place that we've seen this happen recently is Hungary. We've also seen it happen in Ukraine to varying degrees. There are concerns that this is being done throughout the region. On the informational front, we have the rise of alternative, independent news sites, especially on the internet. This is not just the famous case of Russia Today, right, which is infamously a shill for the Kremlin. But in addition to Russia Today, we also have sites like aeronet.cz, which are alternative news sites that often feature headlines like, and I quote, "Russia not guilty of Katyn massacre," "The Ukrainian security services behind genocide of Ruthenians," and this from aeronet.cz. "How do the American intelligence services operate in the Czech Republic?" I will actually click through to the headline for aeronet because their headline today is quite interesting. So excuse me while I do this real quick. If I can even. Actually, we're trying to connect here. Oh, I should. Excellent. Okay. So aeronet.cz is typical of alternative or independent news agencies, and they have headlines like this, right? Kiev to the USA, right? "We thank you for the war and misery." Sorry, that's shifting. Right, with a picture of Petro Poroshenko there, in camouflage, talking about Ukrainian suicides, murders. This kind of reporting is quite common on these sites. And the goal, unlike in the past where censorship, the goal of censorship was very much to restrict the amount of information that people could see and experience, the goal nowadays is to sort of let a million voices speak in the hopes that they drown all of each other out and no coherent truth or reality emerges from this. And this is increasingly successful in a disturbing way. This is in addition to Russian sponsorship of organizations like Aeronet and organizations like the Institute for Strategic Slavonic Studies in the Czech Republic, which have these kinds of headlines featuring these kinds of truths sponsored by the Kremlin, we also have Russian espionage on the uptick. The former head of Czech military intelligence has been quoted as saying that the situation is worse than the Cold War in many ways. And a recent report by BIS, which is the Czech military intelligence, has reported that the number of Russian spies in Prague and the Czech Republic in general is extremely high at the moment, and has actually been high for about a year prior to Russian involvement in Crimea and the current tensions in the region. In addition to that, it's widely rumored, there are a lot of allegations floating around the country about not only Zeman's closeness to Russia, and possible hints of undue influence and corruption involved there, but also Andrej Babiš, this new figure who's emerged at the head of ANO, the Alternative Party. And Babiš, as I said, is a Slovak businessman. He's also a former communist in the 80s, who the Slovak Memory Institute has talked about was an informant for not only the Státní bezpečnost, but also the KGB. Now, he's sued to try to get this removed as libel, but the Slovak Memory Institute is stuck by this, so it does seem that they have some proof or some corroboration for these ties. As I said before, pointing to Hungary as a cautionary lesson of what can go wrong when we take Central European political, economic stability and integration for granted. In Hungary under Viktor Orban, the Fidesz party has seized control of 2/3 of parliament. That's given Viktor Orban the power to appoint 11 out of the 15 Supreme Court justices in Hungary. It's allowed him to write laws and reward political favors in a way that many people have seen as severe backsliding from the ideals of European integration, democracy, the rule of law. So what's the lesson that we can take from all of this? One that I take away, at least, is that American disengagement from the region, but specifically from the Czech Republic, is highly inequalized. And if we look at these graphs just up here, the graph on the left is representative of the decline in funding to national resource centers, to select national resource centers, including Berkeley, Indiana, from 1997 to 2011. Now, as it plunges off that cliff, we might reflect on the fact that last year, when the Crimea crisis was first erupting, the New York Times ran a story in which the State Department did not have enough language experts in either Ukrainian or Russian to really keep up with events on the ground as they were unfolding. And we have to question, in the future, as more and more of the Soviet-era experts begin to retire, who will replace them? And will we have people with the expertise to actually talk about the region, to combat Russian influence in the region, and to safeguard some of the gains for democracy, the rule of law, capital markets that have been gained in the last 25 years?